Morning. Welcome everyone to today's discussion, Locked Up and Locked Down, COVID-19, Prospects for Decarceration and Defunding the Police. Last summer, we saw massive protests, the biggest since the 1960s, in support of the movement for Black lives and its demands against police brutality and systemic racism in the criminal justice system. A system that has led to the current imprisonment of more than 2 million people, majority of whom are Black and brown. The Black Lives Matter movement is aimed at disbanding the carceral system, where police and incarceration are seen as the solution to addressing crimes that substantially arise from poverty. A recent study done by the Brookings Institute illustrates that poverty is the driving force behind crime. It found that only 13% of incarcerated working age men earned more than $15,000 a year before being incarcerated. Last week, the House passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which provides for a number of police reforms. Many criminal justice activists have argued that these reforms cannot end systemic violence and racism in policing. Instead, they have called for defunding the police and redirecting the money to address conditions in the city that give rise to crime. While police budgets have increased phenomenally over the years, budgets to support programs to combat poverty and serve the needs of the community have not. One activist put it this way, quote, "When I see police, I see 100 other jobs smashed into one thing with a gun," end quote. Today, we are fortunate to have Jane Sampur with us to speak about criminalization of poverty, the demand to defund the police, the limitations of current approaches for police reform, and alternatives to incarceration. Jane has been a criminal defense attorney with the Legal Aid Society in New York City for more than a decade. She currently coordinates the Women's Pretrial Release Initiative, which is part of Legal Aid's Decarceration program. That program runs initiatives aimed at reducing the prison population at Rikers Island. Jane is an expert on women's pretrial detention and sentencing and provides training on these issues as well as the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. This is a New York state law that gives judges the flexibility to utilize alternatives to incarceration for survivors of domestic violence who are convicted of crimes related to their abuse. Jane actively advocates for meaningful changes in the criminal justice system, focusing on alternatives to detention, as well as substantive reform of the criminal legal system. Welcome, Jane. Let me begin by asking you to talk about your work and how it relates to the demands we heard this past summer in the protests to defund the police and decarcerate Black and brown people.
Definitely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to participate in this discussion. So when we're talking about the work that I do with decarceration and the Women's Pretrial Release Initiative and how it relates to the larger movement, when we're talking about ending mass incarceration, we can't talk about ending mass incarceration without ending money, bail, and pretrial detention. So the Decarceration Project, as you noted, focuses on bail reform and bail litigation and fighting unaffordable bail and the illegal pretrial detention so that people can fight their charges while they're pending from the community rather than be behind bars. Now, pretrial detention in city jails are a significant contributor to mass incarceration. So a lot of the conversation surrounding mass incarceration tends to focus on prisons, but local jails admit almost 20 times more people annually than prisons actually do. So jails are logging a staggering 10.7 million admissions per year. And the vast majority of people that are being admitted into jails are simply awaiting trial. So these are pretrial detainees, individuals who have not been convicted of any crime, and the vast majority of them are held on unaffordable bail. Now, the idea that people are factually innocent, right? Because we have a criminal justice system that the fundaments are innocent until proven guilty, right? That you're supposed to have this presumption of innocence. It can't be overstated the impact that pretrial detention and unaffordable bail has on somebody's actual case. It results in a higher likelihood of guilty pleas, results in a higher likelihood that that person who is already detained will eventually receive an actual prison sentence. But it also contributes to the very instability that often results in people being involved in the criminal justice system, right? So even for people that are even detained just for a very short period of time, it contributes to significant instability in their lives. You could lose your job, you could lose access, you could lose your rights to your children. There's just so many issues that arise from even short incarceration stays. Now, within the decarceration projects, I run a smaller project called the Women's Pretrial Release Initiative, which is similarly committed to securing the release of individuals pre-trial, but also connects women to community-based services and supports to essentially support them while their cases are pending. Now, the emphasis of my work really is to connect women to services in the community and address the instability that would otherwise make it difficult for them to return to court. So we focus on connection to supportive housing, connection to mental health services, connection to substance abuse services, where applicable, connection to job training and employment resources. There are so many factors that can result in someone having difficulty returning back to court. Part of the work that I do with this project is really trying to shift the culture within the courts about how judges think about, and judges and prosecutors alike think about, the necessity of bail, right? When people are connected to appropriate supports and resources in the community, when women are healthy, mentally, physically, financially, and connected to appropriate services, they're always going to make good on their obligations, right? There's absolutely no need for pretrial detention, because here in New York State, the only purpose of pretrial detention or bail would be to ensure someone's return to court. And when you have someone that's properly connected to services and resources in the community and is healthy, they're always going to make good on their obligations.
Jane, can you just talk a minute about bail reform? We heard a lot about bail reform recently, so that people who had very little money were not being held in jail just because they're poor, when people who have money are able to avoid going to jail because they're able to come up with the money for bail. Has that had a big impact? What's the status of bail reform?
So there was this major push for years by community organizations and community members and different defense organizations and community advocates for really addressing that very issue, the idea that individuals are being criminalized simply for being poor, right? This, like, bail is essentially the perfect example of the criminalization of poverty. And so we did have bail reform passed. The actual legislation that was actually passed wasn't the strongest, but it did result in initially judges not being able to set bail on misdemeanors and non-violent felonies. So the real focus there was making sure that we weren't detaining individuals essentially on low-level crimes on bail that they couldn't afford. Initially, it did result in a steady decline in the pretrial population. However, because the bill essentially removed the discretion of judges to set bail in particular instances, there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of pushback from judges. There was a lot of pushback from police unions. There was a lot of pushback from prosecutors. This idea that judges are somehow the judges are supposed to be the gatekeepers of who should and shouldn't be in the community, when we know that the problem has always been with the bail statute and bail reform has been the discretion of judges. So even when you have a space where, like for instance, this current bail statute, not only did it say that you can't detain people on specific charges, but it also required judges to really consider poverty as an aspect when deciding what the appropriate hold is going to be. So whether or not the hold should be cash bail, or whether or not it should be an actual release with conditions and services. Unfortunately, there was significant rollbacks after a lot of pushback from judges. So early during the pandemic, essentially in the dead of night, without consultation from defense organizations and community organizations that had fought for so long to try to really address bail reform, rollbacks were instituted that allowed judges to set bail on significantly larger groups of people than previously indicated in the last bail statute. And so what we see now is the numbers are slowly climbing back up, unfortunately, in terms of the actual pretrial population.
We saw, with the spread of COVID-19, we read about hundreds of detainees being released from the crowded prisons. But just last week, the New York Times reported that Rikers Island and other New York City jails are more crowded than they were before COVID. Can you just describe what the conditions are like now at Rikers?
Yeah. So first of all, people in jails are among the most at risk of contracting COVID-19, simply because of the actual conditions, right? Living conditions are crowded, they're unsanitary. Rikers Island has poor ventilations, they're old buildings, but they're also more susceptible to serious illness because of a number of pre-existing health conditions. That's associated, right, with a lot of the lack of resources and lack of healthcare, et cetera, in poor Black and brown communities. Now, with respect to our clients on Rikers Island, as I indicated, like they're reporting still very unsanitary and crowded conditions. Individuals that are detained are unable to practice to engage in practices that we know limit the transmission of COVID-19, right? While the rest of us are in the community and we're consistently washing our hands, we're socially distancing, we're wearing PPE. People in jails are living in communal dorms. They're reporting that there isn't enough soap, there aren't enough cleaning products. Clients are reporting that some correction officers are still not wearing PPE, as well as other detainees not wearing PPE. At one point during the pandemic, Rikers had a reported rate of COVID transmission that was higher than anywhere in the world. In addition, for most of the pandemic, there's also been significantly less programming and services available at Rikers Island because of the inability of outside organizations and nonprofit organizations to be able to provide services, but also there's just a significantly restricted access to the programming, to classes, including some trauma counseling and services provided by these nonprofit organizations, which is huge, because when we're talking about individuals that are on Rikers Island, we're talking about people that are currently experiencing a significant form of trauma, and many individuals that come to the space with significant forms of trauma. And so they don't have significant access or any real access to that, and hadn't had for the majority of the pandemic. Additionally, in addition to the actual conditions while they're also having very limited access to the courts and to the justice system. And I put justice system in severe quotes. Then they're having severe access, limited access to that. With virtual courts, there's significant delays. There's an adjournment after adjournment with nothing happening on a number of cases. And clients are frequently not even given the chance to appear virtually for their court dates. Now, initially there was this massive push, right, to get a lot of people released. And there was that. We saw the jail population, dip significantly. It was down to 3,800, which is the lowest it had been in decades. And that was through lawsuits, for defense organizations, writs of habeas corpus, and also programs established by the city in order to help reduce the jail population. But that effort only lasted for a very short time. It was literally from the middle of March to the end of April is when, the city and the state and judges seemed to really believe that COVID, was real for like a month and a half. But then those efforts halted, and the population has been on a steady increase, and it is now actually higher than it was before COVID began.
So let me ask you, the American Civil Liberties Union said that a vast majority of the arrests are not related to serious crimes. As you mentioned, a lot of misdemeanors. People have been thrown into jail pending their hearings for low-level crime. And CUNY professor Alex Vitale stated that the majority of police officers make only one felony arrest per year. And he and others have argued that the police do not protect communities of color. How have you seen this played out in your practice?
Now, when I was in trial practice, this was really exactly my experience, right? That the majority of my caseload was for nonviolent offenses. And for me, it was just further proof that, this fear mongering and the notion that police and the criminal legal system are somehow supposed to protect us from this dangerous underbelly of society. It's just a complete fallacy, right? We're not criminalizing dangerous people in large degrees. We're criminalizing poverty. We're criminalizing histories of trauma. And just to be clear, like even when we're talking about, violent offenses, even the vast majority of violent offenses can be directly linked to poverty and someone's experience and history of trauma. Now, when we talk about police being there to protect us, police were never really designed at all to protect communities of color, right? And they specifically were not designed to protect Black communities. The modern police force, which dates back, the modern police force, which dates back to the 1900s, but it has its true origins, in the American colonies and the American South. It was, began in the 1700s with essentially slave patrols and groups that were, individuals that were patrolling around essentially to stop runaway slaves. And that's really that's the origin of our modern police system. In addition to, the formation of northern police forces that were a response to trying to control immigrants in the 1800s, right? Police weren't designed to protect. Police have always been designed as a mechanism to control people, to control bodies, and specifically to control Black people. And there's very little acknowledgement of the cycle of trauma and harm being perpetuated within Black and brown communities as a result of police presence. There's very little evidence that increased police presence makes communities safer. And in fact, we have, to the contrary, we know the opposite to be true, right? The brutalization and the terrorization of Black communities specifically by the police is well documented, right? It's becoming increasingly common knowledge. We see it all the time in terms of, these videotaped murders of Black people, just outright murder in the streets. In addition to just these ridiculous police killings, we've seen it in lesser forms, which are equally devastating to the community. So just one example is stop and frisk, right? The stop and frisk policies around the country. New York City had an intense stop and frisk policy for years that resulted in the complete violation of hundreds of thousands of Black and brown men. These stop and frisk were essentially subjecting them to routine and state-sanctioned sexual assaults. And people very rarely think about stop and frisk as sexual assaults, but when you really stop and process what that experience is, a stop and frisk is incredibly invasive, right? It involves touching a person's genital areas and private areas. One former police officer described exactly how he frisks someone, right? He starts at the midsection, he runs his fingers around someone's belt, beneath their waistband, he places their hand in their pocket, their groin area, that he was trained to pay special attention to the buttocks and to the groin area, and it was drilled into him that, criminals take advantage of the fact that, police officers are going to be uncomfortable searching those areas. And so he paid special attention to that, right? Including touching someone's genital areas, their buttocks, et cetera, as well as, when women are being searched, touching women's, their breasts and other private areas. If a stranger walked up to you and touched your intimate parts against your will, right? That's an assault. And that's what we had for decades, and still in jurisdictions across the country, and still here in New York City too. The idea of stop and frisk, the idea of a frisk generally, is in of itself extremely invasive. Another example of this sort of constant terror on communities, and that that police just aren't designed to keep us safe. Just think about what was happening in the city at the beginning of COVID, right? COVID-19, we're all terrified. We're in the middle of a global pandemic when we're all simply just trying to stay safe and take care of ourselves, rather than show compassion to communities that are hardest hit by the pandemic, Black and brown communities. There were countless instances of NYPD responding violently to alleged allegations of social distance violations, right? We saw a number of posts on social media where you had these kind of jarring disparities in NYPD's response to alleged COVID violations, right? You saw people in the village, sitting down, having wine and drinking and hanging out and chilling in the parks. And then you have Black people being thrown to the ground by police officers for, not wearing PPE. And so this idea that, police are there to protect us, we have, every indication that that's not the experience of communities of color, particularly Black communities.
Well, then that gets us to the demand to defund the police. And could you talk about what that means when people say are in favor of defunding the police? Does it mean that the police department budgets should be reduced to zero? And can you also respond to the question people raise that if they're being robbed at gunpoint, who would they call?
Yeah. So the call to defund the police is really the only one that makes sense at this point, right? We're talking about divesting from institutions that kill, harm, jail, and control communities of color, and particularly Black communities, and reinvesting those funds into the community, right? Into what to what we know are the create the instability that drives crime, right? So investing in housing, investing in healthcare, investing in income support and employment and other community-based, strategies for future safety, and really thinking about what it looks like to have sustainable and safe communities. It really is about addressing the drivers of crime rather than punishing the effects of crime. It's defunding the police it's about reimagining what communities can look like. Conservatives and folks that are super in support of the police, they'll have you believe that the police are necessary, which we know not to be true. We have a legacy in this country, as Representative Ayanna Pressley says, we have a legacy in this country of treating trauma with trauma, but there's a possibility for something different. If we take what we just discussed, right, that the vast majority of arrests are not for serious crimes, we're talking about poverty crimes and other crimes which are the resulting effect of trauma and communities that have been deprived of resources. So what happens when those exact same communities are now properly resourced, right? When you have properly funded education, when there's significant and safe and dignified housing, when there's employment resources, quality healthcare, mental health care, you have communities that are essentially going to be safer. You have communities that are just essentially going to have less crime. And when you think about those well-resourced communities, think about in comparison. Like I was talking to a friend the other day and talking about how rich communities aren't over-policed, right? One, because the majority of rich communities and wealthy communities here in the United States are predominantly white, right? But they're also so well-resourced that you don't have people that are struggling, with homelessness. You don't have people that are struggling with significant mental health issues that are going unaddressed. So let's just take, for instance, if you were to compare the crime rates, let's say, of Scarsdale, New York, right? And the crime rate really is just the reported crimes per the population of that area, which was per 1,000. And so Scarsdale, New York has a crime rate of 35. And in New York City, we have Scarsdale, New York, for those of you that don't know, it's one of the richest cities in the country. In comparison with New York City and some communities here in Brooklyn, right? You have a crime rate of 221, right? In comparison to 35 and 221. And one of the most significant differences is that community has an abundance of resources, right? They have great schools. They have, you presumably care about, each other in the community in terms of making sure it's properly well-resourced. Individuals have stable incomes, et cetera. And so, like I said, obviously there are a number of factors, including the fact that Scarsdale is, all white or predominantly white versus the diversity here in the city. But it just goes to show this idea that when there are significant resources in a community, there's going to be significantly less crime. Now, the defund the police movement is not just specifically about defunding the police. Like we talked about, it's about cutting the budgets of all harmful institutions. So it's the sheriff's office, the jails and the prisons, and just any harmful institution. And because of course, right, the problem is so big, right? It's not going to just be sufficient to utilize the resources from the police. It's definitely a great start, but when you're defunding also jails and prisons, that's an additional significant pot of money to really reinvest in the community. You know, in 2019, it cost nearly $250,000 a year to house one person at Rikers Island. $250,000. And so reinvesting that money back into communities to make communities healthier, to make communities safer, that's the goal of defunding the police. Now, to those who are concerned with the perceived ramifications of defunding the police, those are typically people who have been traditionally, you know, protected by the police, right? People of means, you know, white people. There's a lot of fear mongering, right? What happens if I get robbed? Who do I call? And the question should be, wouldn't you rather not be robbed in the first place, right? Wouldn't you prefer that everyone in your community has the appropriate resources to be able to sustain themselves, and people don't feel like they need to rob, they don't feel like they need to steal, they have access to the resources that they need to be the healthiest versions of themselves? Now, no one's saying that we shouldn't have first responders, right? But we should be talking about what type of first responders, what should first responders look like? We don't need police to respond to a number of situations that they're just not equipped to respond to, right? So we should be putting that money into first responders that make sense. So mental health professionals, social workers, and other first responders that are really equipped to deal with true crisis intervention.
So crime is real, as you note. Can you talk about transformative justice and restorative justice as the ways that we can address violent crime while still advancing the goals of decarceration and defunding the police?
Yeah, so, you know, activists such as Miriam Kaba have for years been championing the idea of transformative justice and recognizing the complexities of violence in Black communities and the ways in which it's compounded by state violence and poverty, essentially. So transformative justice it's a political framework and approach to responding to violence and harm and abuse within our communities. It really seeks to respond to violence without creating more violence and encouraging harm reduction to encourage essentially less violence. The emphasis is going to be on community-based solutions and individual and community accountability. So the goal is to reduce reliance on systems that maximize violence. So systems like police, the institution of the police that we know perpetuates violence, jails and prisons that we know perpetuate violence and trauma, and really focus on community-based responses and allowing community members to best decide how it is that the harm should be addressed. And you know, within transformative justice, and there's restorative justice programs that really emphasize accountability and are good examples of that. So like restorative justice programs seek to repair rather than sever community ties in the aftermath of a serious crime. So where the system that we have now, there's an alleged crime, someone's hauled off to jail. In terms of restorative justice, restorative justice programs really seek to think about the accountability, what accountability and healing looks like in the community, right? And so accountability and healing aren't mutually exclusive; they're very much interconnected. And just as we're holding people accountable for the violence that they commit, we have to absolutely take accountability and collective accountability for the conditions that give rise to violence in the first place, right? So that's we're talking about poverty, we're talking about the lack of proper housing, mental health, the state violence, and really being able to address that in this space. And so a really good restorative justice model is going to recognize the responsible party who's harmed someone, as well as the survivor, as individuals that have experienced trauma, right? Because the vast majority of people who commit crimes are they themselves survivors of violent crimes and survivors of significant trauma, in addition to experiencing poverty. So restorative justice programs really seek to address the underlying causes of violence and encourage a long-term process of like personal transformation in individuals in the community. So it's a combination of making sure that each individual who's been involved in this space has access to resources and support that they need, but also allowing the person that's been harmed to really be involved in how it is they feel that space should be, that situation should be addressed. One example of a restorative justice program is the Common Justice Program that operates in Brooklyn, and I believe in the Bronx as well. It offers survivors the opportunity to basically have their needs addressed and validated. It offers them counseling and a space for them to really work through their trauma. Excuse me, but afterwards, they also give the opportunity for the parties to actually sit down together. So the harmed party, as well as the party that has done the harm, to sit down, and not necessarily always the harmed party, depending on what that person's comfort level is. Sometimes it's a community surrogate, but it's those individuals being able to sit down with trained counselors and really come up with what they believe to be the appropriate answers to solving the problem that they have before them, as opposed to relying on incarceration and relying on further reliance on the criminal justice system. There could be the understanding that the harmed party would participate in counseling services, would participate in community service, would really focus on not only bettering themselves, but also giving back to the community.
And have you had direct experience with some of these programs? Have you had clients who participated in Transformative Justice program?
I have had clients that have participated in Common Justice, to be specific, but also even outside of the actual criminal justice system, clients who routinely who are able to participate in these healing circles, right? So for instance, clients who are out in the community, they're engaged in supportive services, and they're having a dispute with someone at their supportive housing residence. And that dispute could potentially result in police being called, but rather than police be called, they engage in these healing circles where each party is able to really discuss what happened and address what each other needs and how they feel as they can both grow and learn from that space. So yes, in terms of having clients that have participated in the traditional sense of these restorative justice programs, but also just the transformative justice that happens on the community-based level without engaging in the criminal justice system.
And there have been some studies. Barnard Center for Research on Women did one that talked about recent victories for those organizing around defunding and the kinds of projects you're talking about, Jane. And they said so far, at least since around this summer, over $840 million has been divested from police departments in the US. And over 25 cities have canceled police contracts and removed police from the schools. And they have redirected that money to student and family and community support, as well as restorative justice that you've described. And for example, in Austin, Texas, the city reduced the police budget from 40% of the general fund to 26% and diverted the money to emergency medical services, mental health, first responders, services for homeless people, substance abuse programs, food access, et cetera, et cetera. Are there initiatives along these lines being explored in New York City, because many people have said, defund the police, great phrase, but it's really not realistic. And these are examples that are showing the direction that people are moving in as a result of these demands that are being made by the movement for social justice. So what's happening in New York City?
So, right, so one of the first things that I think, and the primary thing that we should really focus on is what's happening, as you said, in New York City, but specifically as it relates to the demand to defund the police. So Austin was what you described in Austin was able to happen because there was a true commitment to defunding the police and, reinvesting resources in the community and making sure that they're focusing on, there was the Austin project, they ended up buying hotels to then turn into actual, housing to house homeless people. In New York City, though, there is the same push, right, to defund the police, and Communities United for Police Reform, also known CPR, Communities United for Police Reform, they've created and organized a coalition of over 200 groups that have 200 activist groups, community groups, defense organizations, et cetera, all of whom have been advocating for the defunding of New York City's police department and decreasing the budget significantly. So the current baseline demand is defunding and taking away $1 billion from New York City's immense budget. And so this coalition has just done extensive and amazing work, right? They've generated tens of thousands of calls and emails and texts to council members and different organizations and community-based organizations have held teach-ins, et cetera, to really focus and push the issue of defunding the police. Based on all of this pressure that was being put on the city and the mayor eventually did agree to cut $1 billion from NYPD's almost $6 billion expense budget. Unfortunately, de Blasio said that this is what he was going to do, that he heard the cries of the community and that we're going to be taking $1 billion away from the police budget, but that didn't really happen, right? In order to meet their pledge, they relied on a number of kind of budgetary tricks and lies in order to be able to come up with that $1 billion. But fortunately, the campaign continued to organize, public education and really force the issue of where this money is going. And eventually the city had to concede and admit that they had basically tried to pull one over on us and that they hadn't essentially reached the $1 billion of budget cuts. And that it was essentially, a bait and switch and manipulation of math. And one of those examples of this kind of manipulation in math is the mayor, saying that the mayor had claimed that he had cut $3 million from NYPD's budget by simply removing by removing police from schools, right? Removing and it sounded like a win, right? One of the things we're asking for, we're asking for these safety officers, police officers to be removed out of schools. But rather than actually remove those officers from the schools, what they did in turn was they just moved the money to another budget. And the budget that they chose to add it into is the Department of Education budget. And so they didn't remove any police from the schools, but they just transferred where the money was coming from. Now, the fact that it was taken from the Department of Education budget, which is already being defunded because we're in this financial crisis, you have police remaining in schools in the face of spaces where there aren't enough school nurses, there aren't enough youth counselors, et cetera. And so basically them trying to shift the cost of the Department of Education without removing police from the actual schools creates the illusion of defunding, but not actually defunding. And so there's still a lot of push and emphasis for this to actually happen. One of the things that was really just amazing about what the organizers have done with respect to demanding the defunding of NYPD is that they really have created a pathway for making defunding NYPD a reality and really and redirecting NYPD funds to under-resourced communities. They've made it a possibility and certainly essential issue in the lead up to the 2021 citywide elections and budget fight as well. So,
yeah, it's just going to be an ongoing push and push and push, right? We have a number of questions from the audience. One is, can you please talk more about police reform versus defunding the police? I mean, we just saw that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act was passed, which has certain reforms sort of focused on getting rid of bad apples and educate, giving more training to police. And there's been an alternative proposal through the Breathe Act that Congresspersons Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley have been pushing. So can you talk about the idea of police reform versus defunding the police?
Yeah, certainly. So, and those two are like the exact examples, right? So the George Floyd Act focusing on reform, so banning racial profiling, overhauling, qualified immunity, banning chokeholds. Now, while all these are really good measures, right? They're not going to stop the police violence that we witness on the daily basis now. These reforms also focus on things that we know don't work, right? So requiring body-worn cameras, et cetera. It's the push, but we've seen in New York City that it hasn't stopped, police officers from engaging in bad behavior and violent behavior. The significant difference really though is that reforms, which we know don't work, still maintains the same institution. And it not only does it maintain the same sort of racist and violent institution, but it gives more money and contributes to the ever expanding powers of the police over the community. So in order for this new training, in order for these reforms to happen, there needs to be, they're giving more money. And what it does is it ignores the underlying drivers of these police interactions at all. Now, the Breathe Act in comparison is essentially defund in action, right? It's investing resources in the community, essentially to alleviate police violence by creating sustainable neighborhoods, reducing contact with law enforcement. It is the quintessential example of defund the police, right? So there's a section that's focused on divesting federal resources from incarceration, policing, and other organizations that are create harm and violence in the community, and then investing in new approaches to community safety and utilizing these funding initiatives, but more importantly, allocating new money to building healthy and sustainable communities, right? So putting more money into health resources, housing resources, and really holding political leaders accountable to enhancing, Black communities and the self-determination of Black communities. And so the difference really is, one is about defunding the police and the fundaments of it being reinvesting in communities. And the other is just giving more money to police, essentially which police sometimes use for the reforms, which don't work, and essentially just end up expanding their power over communities.
Well, there's another question asking how are people still being jailed on unaffordable bail? Didn't bail reform change that? You addressed that a little bit early in your discussion, that there was a lot of pushback with bail reform. So how is it that people are still being sent to Rikers and other city prisons because they can't come up with the bail money?
Yeah. So one thing I will say before I delve all the way into that question is that so much of the criminal justice system is based on an abuse by individual actors within the system, right? And the resulting effects and the mass effects of continued abuse by a multitude of players within the system. And so when you have significant police on the street making these arrests and even doing legal searches, they're committing harm. And the same respect with judges, If judges have a particular power, they're going to utilize it and oftentimes abuse that power. And that's what we have here currently with even bail reform. So bail reform didn't eliminate cash bail. It did force judges, it did require judges, it hasn't so far as forced them, require judges to consider someone's financial circumstances when setting bail, but judges don't do that, right? The real issue is that anytime judges have an opportunity to utilize their discretion, they're going to utilize it. And what we're seeing now is, even though one judge is supposed to be taking consideration to someone's financial circumstances, they're not. But for instance, on violent crimes was never something that was really addressed with bail reform. But we have a higher percentage of judges of bail being set on violent crimes than previously before, right? And that's a product of judges wanting to utilize whatever little limited discretion they have. So you say, I can't set bail on misdemeanors, but I'm going to set bail on as many violent felonies as I want to. But then also the rollbacks, which before the rollbacks, the judges were required to release anyone that was charged with a misdemeanor or a nonviolent felony. But now there's these additional loopholes created. So you have people sitting on Rikers Island right now for nonviolent offenses on unaffordable bail. And it's loopholes like the harm plus harm provision. So which says that if you're out on bail on a crime that involves some sort of harm to an identifiable person or property, and then you come back into custody on another case that results in or involves harm to an identifiable person or property, you can now have bail set, this, regardless of whether or not it's a misdemeanor or a nonviolent offense. And the harm plus harm provision is being just abused by judges, abused by DAs. An example of a client that I have sitting on Rikers Island right now, and there are many clients sitting on Rikers Island right now on harm plus harm, with the understanding that, let's say they stole something from Rite Aid. They come back into custody on another case of allegedly stealing something from Rite Aid or stealing from Macy's, and judges, prosecutors argue, and judges agree that the harmed party in this instance, in each case, is the Rite Aid Corporation and the Macy's Corporation, and that constitutes harm plus harm. And so you have essentially abuse of discretion, continued manipulation of the law by parties, which results in a number of people continuing to be detained pre-trial. And so when we talk about reforms, right? Reforms don't work when we're talking about people having unlimited discretion and discretion at all to have power over individuals' lives. And that's always going to be true when we're talking about the way judges, the way police, the way actors in the criminal legal system view specifically Black people, right? In order for a judge to be able to set bail continuously on a person in general, you have to have a diminished view and a diminished view of that person's humanity, because you're sentencing them or sent to sitting in a cage like an animal. And when we talk about these systems overall, the goal is always going to be to make sure that communities are properly resourced so that they're not having interactions with police, so that folks are not being arrested, so that they're never even coming before a judge who is never going to understand what their life experience is like, who is never going to understand, who they are as people. When I talk about changing perceptions within, the judiciary about what pretrial detention looks like, I spent a lot of my time convincing the judges of my clients' humanity, right? Of talking about who they are as a person, that they're a mother, that they're loved in the community. This idea that our clients aren't people who are worthy of love and education and resources, much less their own freedom, is so far-fetched for some judges because they just don't have significant interaction with individuals from the communities that I represent.
So one last question is that President Biden and other mainstream Democrats have not only rejected calls to defund the police, but they have criticized the so-called snappy slogan that alienates, they claim, potential allies in the struggle against police brutality. Could you briefly respond to that criticism?
You know, it's lazy advocacy on the part of Democrats, right? They say they care about Black lives. They say they care about Black communities. So what? The slogan "Defund the police" makes people uncomfortable, right? Black Power made people uncomfortable. Black Lives Matter made people uncomfortable. Black Lives Matter still makes people uncomfortable. You know, you don't trivialize the work of a movement as powerful as Black Lives Matter just because elements of the demands and elements of what folks are asking for is uncomfortable for you to explain as a mainstream Democrat. And you're not losing allies. Democrats aren't losing allies simply because the slogan is uncomfortable and difficult to explain. They're losing allies because they're not fully embracing, right, the fundamentals of what it means to defund the police, because they're not taking every possible opportunity to make the connection between crime and the intense deprivation of resources in communities, because they're not discussing the true impact and effects of policing poor Black and Brown communities. They're losing allies because they're not taking the time to help people reimagine, right, what life could look like and what communities could look like if they had the access to proper resources. And Democrats know how to do that, right? They know how to help shift the way people think about what tomorrow could look like, right? That was Yes We Can. Yes We Can was all about, you know, painting a picture of what a better tomorrow could look like. That's what Biden did this time around, right? Unity and coming together after this very painfully and divisive Trump administration. Democrats know how to do it. They're just not taking the time to really support and really understand and really educate, you know, everybody people that they come in contact with about what defund the police means. It's not what the slogan means, right? It's what the actual slogan is. It's really about making sure that people are fully educated on it. And Kianga Mata Taylor made a really good point, right, in the New Yorker article recently, saying that we're essentially a long way from achieving defunding the police, but no social movements are shape its goals by what our most pragmatic and least contentious legislators are thinking and feeling. And so, yeah, defund the police is uncomfortable, but so is Black Power, so is Black Lives Matter. That none of that should stop Democrats who purport to care about, you know, Black communities and Black lives. It shouldn't stop them from, you know, going all the way hard to really explain to people like what it means to have, you know, resources reinvested in Black and Brown communities.
Well, Jane, thank you very much for this really deep analysis of the problems in our criminal justice system and the vision for public safety as an alternative to policing. This has been a really fascinating discussion. In the link, in the chat is a link, or should be a link soon, to CUNY Rising, which in collaboration with the union that represents the faculty and staff at CUNY has been promoting a new deal for CUNY, which is legislation to restore free tuition for CUNY students. And we all know that access to higher education provides a path out of poverty. So check it out and urge your representatives to please support this bill. Jane, I'd like to thank you again for speaking with us. I'd like to thank our audience and the staff at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, which makes this programming possible. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me.